The invitation came disguised as maturity. That should have been my first warning. "I think we should invite Garrett to the housewarming party," Diane said, not looking up from her phone as she scrolled through our contact list. Her fingers moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been texting all morning, thumbs working overtime like they were on commission. I paused in the middle of hanging our new kitchen curtains, pale yellow things that Diane had insisted would brighten the space. The hammer felt heavy in my hand as I turned to look at my wife of 8 years, standing in our brand new living room with its fresh paint smell and boxes still scattered in corners. "Garrett Holtz?" I asked, though we both knew exactly which Garrett she meant. There was only one Garrett in our orbit, and he happened to be the guy she'd dated all through high school before I came along. "Your ex-boyfriend Garrett?" "It would be mature," she said, finally glancing up with that practiced smile she'd been perfecting since we moved to Brackett Hill 6 months ago. "We're all adults now. He's married. We're married. It's not like there's any weird history between us. The thing about living in a small Maine town like Brackett Hill is that everyone knows everyone else's business, and most of that business happened 20 years ago in the back seats of pickup trucks or at graduation parties that people still talk about at Gus's Bar and Grill every Friday night. Diane and Garrett's history wasn't weird. It was legendary. They'd been the golden couple of Brackett Hill High, the kind of pair that made other teenagers believe in fairy tales and happily ever after. Until Garrett knocked up Jenny Morrison 2 weeks before prom, anyway. "Plus," Diane continued, "Nora seems really sweet. I met her at the grocery store last week, and she mentioned how hard it's been making friends since they moved back to town. She's 6 months pregnant, James. We should be neighborly." Nora Holtz. Garrett's wife of 3 years, the woman who'd somehow managed to tame Brackett Hill's most notorious bachelor and convince him to leave his job in Portland to come back home and take over his father's auto body shop. I'd seen her around town, pretty in a wholesome way, with the kind of genuine smile that made you want to help her carry her groceries. "Since when do you care about being neighborly?" I asked, turning back to the curtains. The fabric felt slippery between my fingers as I tried to get the hooks lined up properly. "Since we bought a house in a small town where reputation matters," Diane replied, and there was an edge to her voice that I'd been hearing more often lately. "I work at Brackett Insurance now, not some anonymous office in Portland. These people are going to be our neighbors for the next 30 years. I'd rather they think of us as the friendly couple who throws great parties, not the antisocial weirdos who hide behind their curtains." She had a point, even if I didn't like it. My hardware store on Main Street depended on local customers, and small-town business was built on relationships as much as competitive pricing. If Diane wanted to play the role of the welcoming neighbor, I could swallow my pride for one evening. "Fine," I said, securing the last curtain hook. "Invite them. But I'm not making small talk about the good old days." "You won't have to," Diane said, already typing on her phone. "I'm sure you and Garrett will find plenty to talk about. You both work with your hands, you both understand small business. You might even like each other." I climbed down from the step stool and folded it up, studying my wife as she composed her invitation text. Diane had always been beautiful, the kind of woman who turned heads at the grocery store and made other wives grip their husbands' arms a little tighter. At 34, she still had the same thick auburn hair and green eyes that had caught my attention at a Portland coffee shop 9 years ago. But lately, there was something different about her. A restlessness that showed up in the way she checked her phone constantly, the way she'd started wearing perfume to run errands, the way she'd insisted we needed to make a fresh start by moving back to her hometown. "There," she said, hitting send with a satisfied smile. "Done. They'll probably be thrilled to get out of the house. Nora mentioned that Garrett's been working late at the shop almost every night, trying to build up the customer base." The housewarming party was scheduled for Saturday night, just a casual gathering of neighbors and new friends to show off our renovated colonial and officially announce our arrival in Brackett Hill society. Diane had been planning it for weeks, creating Pinterest boards full of appetizer ideas and string light arrangements. She'd ordered wine from Portland and bought enough cheese to feed a small army. "How many people are we expecting?" I asked, surveying our living room and trying to calculate how many bodies it could reasonably hold. "Maybe 25, 30 at most," Diane said. "Just the important people. Your friend Eli from the hardware store, my boss Karen and her husband, the Hendersons from next door, Pastor Blake and his wife, Gus from the bar, the core group." The core group. In the 6 months we'd been living in Brackett Hill, Diane had mapped out the town's social hierarchy with the precision of a military strategist. She knew who mattered, who had influence, who could help or hurt our reputation. It was one of the things that had made her successful in insurance sales, the ability to read people and situations, to know exactly what they wanted to hear. "I should probably get some beer," I said. "Eli's not much of a wine drinker, and I doubt Gus is either." "Already taken care of," Diane replied, waving her phone. "I ordered a case of Budweiser and a case of Sam Adams. They'll deliver it Friday afternoon." Of course she had. Diane had been handling the party planning with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. Color-coded lists, detailed timelines, contingency plans for weather and dietary restrictions. Sometimes I wondered if she'd married me because I fit into her life plan rather than because she actually loved me. The thought came out of nowhere, sharp and unwelcome. I pushed it aside and focused on the practical details of hosting a party in a house we'd only been living in for 6 months. The guest room still needed a fresh coat of paint, and there were boxes in the basement that we hadn't unpacked yet. Our yard was presentable but not impressive, and I still hadn't figured out the quirks of our new heating system. "Maybe I should check the guest room paint situation," I said, "in case anyone needs to use it for coats or purses or whatever." "Good idea," Diane agreed. "I think there's still a can of the sage green in the basement. Just do a quick touch-up on that wall behind the bed. It got scuffed when we moved the furniture in." I headed upstairs to assess the damage, but my mind was still stuck on the guest list. 25 to 30 people meant this wasn't just a casual get-together. It was a statement. Diane was announcing our place in Brackett Hill society, establishing our credentials as the kind of couple who belonged in a town where your great-grandfather's reputation still mattered. The guest room was small but comfortable, with a double bed and a window that looked out over our backyard toward the woods. The sage green paint was mostly intact, but there were indeed a few scuffs on the wall behind the headboard where we'd been careless with the furniture. Nothing that couldn't be fixed with a small brush and 20 minutes of work. I was examining the scuffs when I heard Diane's phone buzz downstairs, followed by her delighted laugh. The sound carried up through the old house's thin floors, bright and musical in a way that reminded me of how she used to laugh when we first started dating. Back then, everything was funny to Diane. My clumsy attempts at cooking, the way I sang along to the radio, the faces I made when I was concentrating on something difficult. When was the last time I'd made her laugh like that? Another buzz, another laugh. Whoever was texting her was apparently hilarious. I went downstairs to find Diane still on her phone, grinning at the screen like she'd just won the lottery. "Good news?" I asked. "Garrett and Nora can make it," she said, not looking up. "They're really excited. Garrett says he's been wanting to meet the guy who finally convinced me to leave the big city." The way she said it made something twist in my stomach. Not jealousy exactly, more like the feeling you get when you realize you've been walking around with your shirt inside out all day and nobody bothered to tell you. "Great," I said. "I'll make sure to have some stories ready about the glamorous world of hardware retail." Diane finally looked up from her phone, and for a moment her expression was unreadable. Then she smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't have to be defensive, James. I'm proud of what you've built with the store. I just think it's nice that we're finally in a place where we can entertain properly, where we have something to show for all our hard work." She was right, of course. The hardware store was doing well, better than I'd expected when I'd bought it from old Pete Morrison 2 years ago. The house was beautiful, a 1920s colonial that we'd renovated with careful attention to period details and modern conveniences. We had good jobs, no kids to complicate things, and enough money in the bank to sleep soundly at night. So why did I feel like something was wrong? "I'm going to run to the store and grab some paint," I said. "The guest room needs a touch-up." "Okay," Diane said, already looking back at her phone. "I'll start working on the appetizer list." I grabbed my keys and headed out to the truck, but instead of driving straight to Morrison's Hardware, my hardware store now, though I still thought of it as Pete's place, I took the long way through downtown Brackett Hill. Main Street was quiet on a Wednesday afternoon, just a few cars parked outside the post office and Gus's bar and grill. The autumn leaves were starting to turn, painting the maple trees in shades of gold and crimson that would bring leaf peepers from Boston in another few weeks. It was a beautiful town, the kind of place where people still waved to each other on the street and knew their neighbors' names. The kind of place where a man could build a good life with an honest business and a loving wife. The kind of place where everyone would know if that loving wife was texting her high school boyfriend. I parked outside the hardware store and sat in the truck for a moment, watching the pedestrians walk past on their afternoon errands. Mrs. Henderson from next door was coming out of the bank, her arms full of shopping bags. Eli Peterson was loading lumber into his pickup outside the store, probably working on another one of his weekend projects. Pastor Blake was walking toward the church, his head down like he was practicing his Sunday sermon. Normal people living normal lives in a normal town. So why did I feel like I was watching them through glass, like I was somehow separate from all this ordinary contentment? My phone buzzed. A text from Diane. "Don't forget we need more wine glasses. Maybe get some plastic ones just in case?" I texted back, "Sure thing. Home in an hour." But I sat in the truck for another 10 minutes, watching the people of Brackett Hill go about their business and wondering when I'd started feeling like a stranger in my own life. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made you want to light fires and drink mulled cider. Diane had been in preparation mode since dawn, arranging flowers and adjusting lighting, and generally treating our housewarming party like it was a state dinner. I'd spent the morning moving furniture and setting up a makeshift bar in the dining room, trying to stay out of her way while she orchestrated the evening's events. "The Hendersons will probably be first," she said, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror for the 5th time. She'd chosen a black dress that was elegant without being too formal, paired with the pearl earrings I'd given her for our anniversary last year. They're always early to everything, then Pastor Blake and his wife, then probably Karen and her husband. I straightened my tie and tried to look enthusiastic. I'd gone with khakis and a button-down shirt, dressed up enough to show respect for our guests, casual enough to suggest I was comfortable in my own home. The house looked good, I had to admit. Diane had a talent for creating atmosphere, and the warm lighting combined with the smell of her homemade spinach artichoke dip made our place feel genuinely welcoming. "What time did Garrett and Nora say they'd be here?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why I cared. "Around 7:30, Diane replied, adjusting a flower arrangement on the side table. "Nora mentioned that she gets tired easily these days, so they probably won't stay too late." The first guests arrived at exactly 6:30, the Hendersons, as predicted, bearing a bottle of wine and enthusiastic compliments about our landscaping. Within an hour, our living room was full of conversation and laughter, the kind of easy social atmosphere that made hosting parties worthwhile. Eli had claimed a spot near the bar and was holding court with stories from his days as a Portland police officer. Pastor Blake was discussing local history with Karen's husband, a retired teacher who collected antique maps. Diane moved through the groups like a natural hostess, making sure everyone had drinks and introducing people who hadn't met. I was refilling the cheese plate when I heard Diane's voice rise above the general conversation. "Garrett, Nora, I'm so glad you could make it." I looked up to see them in the doorway. Garrett Holtz in person for the first time since high school graduation. He'd filled out since then, his shoulders broader and his face more weathered from years of working with his hands. Still handsome in that rugged way that made women look twice, but with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of long days and hard work. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that looked expensive despite its casual appearance. Nora stood beside him, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other clutching a covered dish. She was prettier than I'd realized from seeing her around town. Blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, blue eyes bright with genuine warmth. The pregnancy suited her, giving her that glow that people always talked about but rarely seemed real. "Thank you so much for inviting us," Nora said, handing the dish to Diane. "I brought brownies. I hope that's okay. I've been craving chocolate constantly lately." "They smell amazing," Diane replied, accepting the dish with a smile that seemed perfectly natural. "James, come meet our guests." I made my way over, wiping my hands on a dish towel and trying to summon the right level of friendliness. Garrett extended his hand with a firm grip and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "James Waverly," he said. "I've heard a lot about you. Diane says you've done wonders with Morrison's hardware." "Just trying to keep the doors open," I replied. "And you're taking over your dad's auto shop, right? That's a big responsibility." "It's been a learning curve," Garrett admitted. 30 years of customer relationships and vendor contracts to figure out, but the work is steady, and it's good to be back home. There was something in the way he said home that made me glance at Diane. She was listening to our conversation with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for important clients, her head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture I recognized as her interested and engaged pose. "Let me get you both something to drink," I said. "Beer, wine, or we have soft drinks if you prefer." "Beer sounds great," Garrett said. "Whatever you've got." "Just water for me," Nora added, patting her belly with a rueful smile. "The baby has very strong opinions about alcohol these days." I headed to the bar, but I could hear their conversation continuing behind me. Diane was asking about the pregnancy. When was the baby due? Did they know if it was a boy or girl? Had they picked out names yet? The kind of polite small talk that filled the gaps at parties. Except there was something about Diane's tone that seemed more than politely interested. "January 15th, Nora was saying. "And it's a girl. We're thinking about Emma, but we haven't decided for sure." "Emma's a beautiful name," Diane replied. "Classic, but not too old-fashioned." I returned with their drinks and found myself studying the three of them, my wife, her high school boyfriend, and his pregnant wife, trying to read the undercurrents in their conversation. Nora seemed completely at ease, chatting about nursery decorations and baby preparations with the enthusiasm of a first-time mother. Garrett was more reserved, his attention divided between his wife and the room full of strangers he was meeting for the first time. And Diane was performing. I recognized the signs from watching her work with difficult clients, the slightly exaggerated gestures, the way she mirrored other people's body language, the careful modulation of her voice to match the energy of the conversation. She was working to make a good impression, which was normal enough for a hostess. But there was something else there, a current of excitement that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "James was just telling me about the hardware business," Garrett said, including me in the conversation. "Sounds like you've got a good thing going." "It's honest work," I replied. "Though I suspect auto repair keeps you busier than selling screws and paintbrushes." "Different kinds of problems," Garrett said with a laugh. "Your customers probably don't call you at midnight because their car won't start." "No, but they do expect me to know exactly which bolt they need to fix their kitchen faucet based on a description that starts with, 'It's about this big and kind of silver.'" That got a genuine laugh from both Garrett and Nora, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. Maybe this wouldn't be as awkward as I'd feared. Maybe we really could all be adults about ancient history. I should introduce you to some of the other guests, Diane said, touching Garrett's arm lightly. There are a few people here who might be good for business connections. She guided him toward the group around Eli, leaving me with Nora. I found myself genuinely liking Garrett's wife. She was easy to talk to, with a self-deprecating sense of humor and obvious intelligence. She asked thoughtful questions about the house renovation and shared stories about her own attempts to decorate their place on a budget. Garrett's been working so hard to build up the business, she said, watching her husband across the room. Sometimes I think he forgets that we moved back here to have a better quality of life, not to work ourselves into the ground. Starting a business is tough, I agreed, especially when you're taking over from someone else. There's a lot of pressure to prove yourself. Exactly. And everyone in town remembers him as this wild teenager who was always getting into trouble. He's trying to show them he's changed, that he's responsible now. I followed her gaze to where Garrett was talking with Eli and Pastor Blake, his posture relaxed but attentive. He did look like a man trying to make a good impression, someone aware that his reputation was still being formed in the minds of potential customers and neighbors. But as I watched, I noticed something else. Every few minutes, Garrett's eyes would find Diane across the room, tracking her movement as she circulated among the guests. And when their gazes met, there was a moment of connection that lasted just a beat too long. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was looking for problems that didn't exist, reading significance into perfectly innocent glances between old friends. But I'd been married to Diane for 8 years, and I knew the difference between polite interest and genuine attraction. How long have you and Garrett been together? I asked Nora, trying to keep my voice casual. We met in Portland about 4 years ago, she said. I was working at a dental office, and he brought his truck into the shop next door. It took him 3 visits to finally ask me out, and I was starting to think he was just really bad at automotive maintenance. She laughed at the memory, her face lighting up with obvious affection. Whatever doubts I might have about her husband, it was clear that Nora was completely in love and blissfully unaware of any undercurrents in the room. And you're happy to be back in Brackett Hill? I asked. I love it here, she said without hesitation. I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire, so this feels like coming home. Everyone's been so welcoming, and I can't wait to raise Emma somewhere where she'll know all her neighbors and have the kind of childhood you only get in places like this. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself smiling despite the unease that had been building in my chest all evening. This was what Diane and I had wanted when we moved here. The sense of community, the slower pace, the feeling of being part of something larger than ourselves. So why did I feel like I was watching it all from the outside? The party continued around us, conversations flowing and laughter filling the rooms of our carefully renovated house. I played my role as host, making sure glasses stayed full and introducing people who hadn't met. But part of my attention remained focused on Diane and Garrett, tracking their movements through the crowd like a security camera sweeping a parking lot. They weren't doing anything obviously inappropriate. They didn't spend more time talking to each other than to other guests. They didn't touch beyond the casual contact of people navigating a crowded room. But there was something in their body language, a subtle awareness of each other's presence that spoke of shared history and unfinished business. Or maybe I was losing my mind. Around 8:30, as the party was hitting its stride and the noise level was rising with the alcohol consumption, I noticed Diane and Garrett near the staircase, their heads bent together in what looked like a private conversation. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the general party chatter, but I could see Diane's animated gestures and Garrett's attentive posture. Then Diane glanced around the room, her gaze sweeping over the guests with the calculating look she got when she was solving a problem. Her eyes met mine across the crowd, and she smiled, the same bright hostess smile she'd been wearing all evening. But there was something else there, a flicker of excitement or anticipation that made my stomach tighten. She said something to Garrett, who nodded and followed her toward the hallway that led to the guest room. "We painted that room last week," I heard Diane say to someone who'd asked about the house tour. "The color turned out even better than I expected. Let me show you." And then they disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing in my own living room with a growing sense that something was about to go very wrong. The guest room door clicked shut. I counted to 60, watching the second hand sweep around my watch face while conversations continued around me. Nora was talking to the Hendersons about pregnancy symptoms. Eli was telling Pastor Blake about a fishing trip he'd taken last summer. Karen was admiring the flower arrangements that Diane had spent all afternoon perfecting. Normal party sounds, normal party conversations. Nothing unusual except for the fact that my wife had just disappeared into a bedroom with her high school boyfriend. At 60 seconds, I excused myself from a conversation about property taxes and walked casually toward the hallway. The guest room door was still closed, no sounds coming from inside. I stood there for a moment, listening to my own heartbeat and wondering if I was about to make a terrible mistake. Then I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I'd saved 3 days ago, just in case. Nora's number. I'd gotten it from Diane's phone while she was in the shower, telling myself it was just practical to have contact information for our guests. Now I was grateful for that moment of paranoid preparation. I typed quickly, "Hi Nora, this is James. Could you come to the guest room upstairs? There's something I think you should see." I hit send and waited, my phone clutched in my sweaty palm like evidence of a crime I hadn't committed yet. 20 minutes later, I heard a car door slam in our driveway, followed by quick footsteps on our front porch. I was waiting by the door when Nora walked in, her face flushed and her eyes bright with concern. "James? What's wrong? Your text sounded urgent." Behind her, I could see Gus from the bar climbing out of his truck, along with 2 other people I didn't immediately recognize. Apparently, Nora hadn't come alone. "I think," I said carefully, "there's something happening upstairs that you need to see." The look on her face told me she understood exactly what I meant. Nora's face went through a series of expressions in the span of about 3 seconds. Confusion, understanding, and then a cold fury that transformed her from a glowing pregnant woman into someone you definitely didn't want to cross. She placed both hands on her belly as if protecting the baby from what she was about to discover, and walked toward the staircase with the determined stride of a woman who'd suspected this moment might come. "Where?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her eyes. "Guest room," I said, following behind her. "End of the hall." Gus and his companions had followed us inside, drawn by the kind of instinct that small-town people develop for drama. Word spreads fast in Brackett Hill, and apparently, my cryptic text to Nora had been interpreted as an invitation to witness whatever was about to unfold. The party continued in the living room, most of our guests unaware that anything unusual was happening. But I could see Eli watching us from across the room, his ex-cop instincts picking up on the tension. Pastor Blake had also noticed the small procession heading upstairs, his conversation trailing off as he tried to figure out what was going on. Nora reached the guest room door and paused, her hand on the knob. For a moment, I thought she might change her mind, might decide that some truths were better left undiscovered. Then she straightened her shoulders and turned the handle. The door swung open to reveal exactly what I'd expected and hoped I wouldn't find. Diane was sitting on the edge of the bed, her black dress slightly wrinkled and her lipstick smeared. Garrett was standing near the window, his flannel shirt unbuttoned and his hair disheveled. They both looked up with expressions of shock and guilt that would have been comical if the situation weren't so devastating. For a moment, nobody said anything. The silence stretched out like a held breath, filled with the weight of 8 years of marriage and 4 years of Nora's relationship with Garrett and the dreams of a baby girl named Emma who deserved better than this. Then Nora spoke, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes right before a hurricane makes landfall. "Well," she said. "This is interesting." Diane scrambled to her feet, her hands smoothing down her dress in a gesture that was both automatic and useless. "Nora, this isn't what it looks like." "Really?" Nora interrupted. "Because it looks like you're in a bedroom with my husband, both of you looking like you've been doing something other than discussing paint colors." Garrett had the decency to look ashamed, his eyes focused on the floor as he buttoned his shirt with shaking fingers. "Nora, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," his wife replied. "You always were good with explanations. Remember when you explained why you were 2 hours late for dinner last week? Or why you've been working so many evenings lately? I bet you have a really creative explanation for this, too." By now, the commotion had drawn more attention from downstairs. I could hear footsteps on the stairs, voices asking what was happening. Our carefully orchestrated housewarming party was turning into the kind of public spectacle that would be talked about in Brackett Hill for years to come. Diane tried a different approach, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used with difficult insurance clients. "We were just talking, catching up on old times. Nothing happened, I swear." "With the door closed?" Nora asked. "In a bedroom? While your husband is downstairs playing host?" That's when I realized that half our guest list was now crowded in the hallway behind us, drawn by the kind of irresistible pull that comes with witnessing other people's private disasters. Eli was there, along with the Hendersons, Pastor Blake, and several others. Their faces showed various combinations of shock, embarrassment, and the guilty fascination that comes with seeing your neighbors' lives implode in real time. Gus, who had apparently appointed himself as narrator for the evening's events, was whispering commentary to anyone within earshot. I knew something was up when she called me asking for Nora's address, said it was urgent. Diane's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "We're all adults here. Garrett and I have a history, yes, but that doesn't mean we can't have a private conversation without everyone jumping to conclusions." "A private conversation," Nora repeated slowly. "In a bedroom, with the door locked." "It wasn't locked," Garrett said, finally looking up from the floor. It was possibly the worst thing he could have said, implying that they'd simply been careless rather than deliberately secretive. Nora turned to look at her husband with an expression that could have frozen water. "Oh, well, that makes it so much better. Thank you for clarifying that you weren't even trying to hide what you were doing." "We weren't doing anything," Diane insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. The lipstick smeared across her mouth and the wrinkled state of her dress told a different story than her words. I found myself studying my wife's face, looking for some sign of the woman I'd married 8 years ago. The woman who'd cried during our wedding vows, who'd held my hand during my father's funeral, who'd celebrated with me when we'd finally saved enough money to buy our first house. But all I could see was a stranger wearing Diane's face, someone who'd been planning this moment while I hung curtains and worried about having enough beer for our guests. "How long has this been going on?" Nora asked, her hands still protectively covering her belly. "Nothing's been going on," Garrett said quickly. "This was just... It was a mistake. A moment of weakness. It didn't mean anything." Another terrible answer. Nora's face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might faint. But instead, she straightened up to her full height and looked at both of them with the kind of dignity that comes from being completely and utterly betrayed. "A moment of weakness," she repeated. "Is that what you're going to tell Emma when she asks why Mommy and Daddy don't live together anymore?" The mention of their unborn daughter seemed to hit Garrett like a physical blow. He stepped toward Nora, his hand outstretched, but she backed away from him with a look of revulsion. "Don't," she said. "Don't you dare touch me right now." The crowd in the hallway had grown larger, and I realized that our housewarming party had officially become the most entertaining event in Brackett Hill's recent history. By tomorrow morning, everyone in town would know exactly what had happened in our guest room, and the story would probably improve with each retelling. Diane seemed to realize this too, because she made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Everyone needs to calm down," she said, looking around at our audience. "This is a private matter between friends, and it's being blown completely out of proportion." "Friends," Nora said, and laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "Is that what we are? Because I thought we were neighbors. I thought we were going to be the kind of people who had barbecues together and watched each other's kids grow up. I thought your husband was a decent man who deserved better than a wife who sneaks around with other women's husbands." She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been sympathy. "I'm sorry, James. You seem like a good man. You deserve better than this." Then she pulled something out of her purse, her wedding ring, and threw it at Garrett's feet. It hit the hardwood floor with a small metallic sound that seemed incredibly loud in the sudden silence. "I'll be staying at my sister's in Portland," she told him. "My lawyer will be in touch." She pushed through the crowd in the hallway, her head held high despite the tears that had started streaming down her face. I heard the front door slam, followed by the sound of a car engine starting in our driveway. Garrett stared at the ring on the floor for a long moment, then bent to pick it up. His hands were shaking as he slipped it into his pocket. "I should go after her," he said, but he didn't move. "I don't think that's a good idea," Pastor Blake said gently. "Maybe give her some time to process what just happened." The crowd in the hallway was starting to disperse, our guests making awkward excuses about early mornings and babysitters. The party was clearly over, undone by the kind of drama that would be dissected and analyzed in every coffee shop and beauty salon in Brackett Hill for weeks to come. Diane stood in the middle of the guest room, looking lost and defiant at the same time. Her carefully planned evening had turned into a disaster, and I could see her trying to figure out how to spin this in a way that wouldn't completely destroy her reputation. "James," she said, "we need to talk." "Yes," I agreed. "We do, but not here and not now." Garrett had finally moved toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I should go," he said to no one in particular. I need to figure out how to fix this." "Some things can't be fixed," Eli said from the doorway. He'd stayed behind after the other guests left, probably sensing that I might need a friend. "Some things, once they're broken, they stay broken." After Garrett left, the house felt eerily quiet. Diane and I moved through the rooms like strangers, cleaning up the remnants of our housewarming party without speaking. Half-empty wine glasses, abandoned appetizer plates, the brownies that Nora had brought sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Diane said finally, breaking the silence as we loaded the dishwasher. "How was it supposed to happen?" I asked. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. I could see it in her face, the guilt, the regret, and underneath it all, a flicker of something that might have been relief. Relief that the pretending was over, that she didn't have to keep up the charade of being happily married to a man she'd settled for when she couldn't have the one she really wanted. "I think," I said carefully, "you should pack a bag and stay somewhere else tonight." "James." "Just for tonight," I interrupted. "We both need time to think about what happens next." She nodded, tears finally starting to fall. But as she headed upstairs to pack, I noticed that she took her phone with her, and I heard the soft sound of typing as she climbed the stairs. Even now, even after everything that had happened, she was still texting someone. I had a pretty good idea who. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made you want to stay in bed and pretend the previous day had been a bad dream. But the empty coffee cup on Diane's side of the bed and the stack of business cards from our ruined party scattered across the kitchen counter were proof that everything had actually happened. I sat at the kitchen table with my first cup of coffee, staring out at our backyard and trying to figure out what came next. In the space of about 20 minutes the night before, My marriage had imploded, my reputation in Brackett Hill had been permanently altered, and I'd become the subject of the kind of gossip that would follow me to the grocery store for months. My phone had been buzzing since 7 a.m. with text messages from people who'd been at the party, along with a few from people who hadn't been there but had already heard the story secondhand. The Brackett Hill Gossip Network was more efficient than the internet when it came to spreading news about other people's disasters. Eli had sent the most straightforward message: "You okay? Call if you need anything." The Hendersons had texted their thanks for a memorable evening and their hopes that everything works out for the best. Pastor Blake had offered his services as a counselor if Diane and I wanted to work through this difficult time together. But it was the message from Gus that really captured the mood. "Hell of a party, Jim. Haven't seen drama like that since the Kowalski divorce back in '98. I was contemplating whether to respond to any of them when I heard a car in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see Diane's Honda pulling up next to my truck. She sat behind the wheel for a moment before getting out, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd had very little sleep and possibly too much wine. She came through the front door like she was entering a stranger's house, her movements tentative and uncertain. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before, her makeup smeared and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that suggested she'd slept on someone's couch. "We need to talk," she said, standing in the kitchen doorway like she wasn't sure she was welcome in her own home. "Coffee's fresh," I replied, not looking up from my phone. She poured herself a cup and sat down across from me at the table we'd bought together 6 months ago, when we were still planning a future that included shared meals and comfortable silence and the kind of partnership that survives small-town gossip. "I stayed at Tara's," she said, referring to her friend from work. "She has a spare room." I nodded, still not trusting myself to speak. The anger was there, simmering just below the surface, but it was mixed with something else, a strange sense of relief that the pretending was finally over. "James, about last night—" "Which part?" I interrupted. "The part where you invited your ex-boyfriend to our housewarming party, or the part where you disappeared into our guest room with him, or the part where half the town watched your boyfriend's pregnant wife throw her wedding ring at his feet?" Diane flinched at the word boyfriend, but she didn't deny it. "It's not what you think." "Really? Because what I think is that you've been planning this for weeks. The party, the guest list, the convenient excuse to show Garrett our house. It was all set up for whatever happened in that room." "Nothing happened," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Diane, I've been married to you for 8 years. I know what you look like when you've been fooling around, and I know what guilty looks like on your face. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was innocent." She stared into her coffee cup, her shoulders sagging with the weight of being caught in a lie she couldn't maintain. "Okay, yes, we kissed. That's all. It was stupid and impulsive, and it didn't mean anything." It meant something to Nora. Nora overreacted. She's hormonal and emotional because of the pregnancy. "Stop." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was tired of listening to Diane rationalize her way out of responsibility. "Don't blame Nora for your choices. She's 6 months pregnant, and her husband was making out with another woman at a party. I think her reaction was pretty reasonable." Diane looked up at me with eyes that were red from crying or lack of sleep, or both. "So what happens now?" It was a good question. I'd been married to this woman for 8 years, owned a house with her, built a life that was tangled up with hers in 1,000 different ways. The practical part of my brain was already calculating the logistics of separation. Who would stay in the house? How we'd divide our belongings? Whether I'd be able to afford the mortgage on my own? But there was another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since I'd sent that text to Nora, that was thinking about something else entirely. "I think," I said slowly, "that depends on what you want." "I want to fix this," she said quickly. "I want us to go to counseling and work through this and save our marriage." "Do you?" I asked. Or do you want to avoid the embarrassment of being known as the woman who broke up 2 marriages for a high school romance that didn't work out? The question hung between us like a challenge. Diane's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like resignation. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know what I want anymore. At least she was being honest. It was more than I'd gotten from her in months. Well, I said, standing up and carrying my coffee cup to the sink. While you're figuring that out, I'm going to make some decisions of my own. What kind of decisions? I turned to look at her. This woman who'd shared my bed and my dreams and my bank account for 8 years, and felt something cold and calculating settle into place where my love for her used to be. The kind that protect my interests, I said, starting with a conversation with my lawyer. Her face went pale. James, you don't need to. Yeah, Diane, I do. Because while you were staying at Tara's last night, I was thinking about a lot of things, like how you've been working late 3 nights a week for the past 2 months, like how you insisted we needed to move back to your hometown right around the time Garrett got divorced from his first wife, like how you've been checking your phone constantly and smiling at text messages you never let me see. Each point hit her like a physical blow, and I could see the realization dawning that I'd been paying more attention than she'd thought. This wasn't some impulse, I continued. This was planned. You've been having an affair, emotional if not physical, and last night was just the first time you got caught. That's not true. Prove it, I said. Show me your phone. Let me see those text messages you've been so protective of. She clutched her purse tighter, and I had my answer. I thought so, I said. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack whatever you need for the next few days, and you're going to stay somewhere else while we both figure out what we want. And I'm going to talk to my lawyer about protecting the business and the house and everything else I've worked for. You can't just kick me out of my own home. Watch me, I said. Because here's the thing, Diane. I've got a dozen witnesses who saw you coming out of a bedroom with another woman's husband. In Maine, that's called adultery, and it has consequences in divorce proceedings. The word divorce seemed to hit her like a slap. She stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I wasn't. I need to get some air, I said, grabbing my keys from the counter. When I get back, I'd appreciate it if you weren't here. I left her sitting at our kitchen table and drove to the hardware store, even though it was Sunday and we were closed. Sometimes a man needs to be surrounded by things that make sense, nuts and bolts and tools that do exactly what they're designed to do without hidden agendas or secret text messages. The store was quiet and familiar, smelling of sawdust and metal and the kind of honest work that didn't involve emotional manipulation. I sat behind the counter and called my lawyer's answering service, leaving a message that I needed to schedule an appointment as soon as possible. Then I called Eli. "How you holding up?" he asked without preamble. "I've been better," I admitted, "but I think I'm done pretending this is something it's not." "Good," he said. "That woman's been playing games with you for months. Time you started playing back." "I need a favor," I said. "Name it." "I need you to help me change the locks on my house." There was a pause, then a chuckle that held no humor. "When do you want to do it?" "Today, this afternoon, before she decides to come back with Garrett and clean out our bank account." "I'll be there in an hour," Eli said. "And Jim, you're doing the right thing." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet store and thought about the conversation I'd just had with my wife. 8 years of marriage, and it had come down to accusations and threats and lawyers. Part of me was sad about that. Sad for the people we'd been when we first fell in love. Sad for the dreams we'd shared that would never come true now. But a bigger part of me was angry. Angry at being lied to, angry at being made a fool of in front of half the town, angry at being treated like an obstacle to be managed rather than a husband to be respected. And underneath the anger was something else, something cold and focused and determined. If Diane wanted to play games, I was going to show her what a real player looked like. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, I thought it might be Diane, but the number wasn't one I recognized. "This is Nora. I wanted to thank you for last night. It took courage to show me the truth, even though it hurt. I won't forget that." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I'm sorry you had to see that. You deserved better." Her response came quickly. "We both did. I'm meeting with my lawyer tomorrow. If you need any information about their relationship, I might be able to help." I smiled for the first time since waking up. Diane had made one crucial mistake in her planning. She'd assumed that the people she hurt would just accept it and move on. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. Monday morning brought the first real frost of the season, coating the windows of Morrison's Hardware with ice crystals that caught the early sunlight like tiny prisms. I arrived at the store before 8, grateful for the familiar routine of opening up, turning on the lights, and preparing for a day of honest transactions with people who said what they meant. The weekend's drama had already reached Main Street, of course. Mrs. Henderson stopped by for a bag of rock salt and managed to work 3 separate expressions of sympathy into a 5-minute conversation about winter preparation. Gus came in looking for furnace filters and offered his opinion that some women just can't appreciate a good man when they've got one. But it was the phone call I received around 10:30 that really started the week off right. "James, this is Nora Holtz. I hope I'm not bothering you at work." "Not at all," I said, stepping away from the customer I'd been helping with paint samples. "How are you doing?" "Better than I expected, actually," she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost energized. "I wanted to follow up on what I mentioned yesterday, about information that might be helpful. I'm listening. I've been going through Garrett's things, the stuff he left at our place when he moved out yesterday, and I found some interesting items: text messages, emails, receipts from places he claimed he was working late. Would you be interested in seeing them?" I felt that cold, calculating feeling settle into my chest again. "Very interested. When would be convenient?" "I'm staying at my sister's place in Portland, but I could drive down this afternoon. Maybe we could meet somewhere private. I have a feeling this conversation is going to be enlightening." We arranged to meet at a small diner about 20 minutes outside Brackett Hill, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and nobody paid attention to other people's business. I spent the rest of the morning helping customers and thinking about what Nora might have discovered and what it might mean for the conversation I was planning to have with my lawyer. The diner was exactly what I'd expected: vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting, and coffee that could strip paint. Nora was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a manila folder and the expression that suggested she'd had some very unpleasant revelations over the past 24 hours. "Thank you for coming," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to get involved in this mess." "I'm already involved," I pointed out. "The question is whether I'm going to be a victim or a participant." She smiled at that, a sharp expression that transformed her face from sweet and pregnant to someone you definitely didn't want to underestimate. "I like that attitude. I think we're going to work well together." She opened the folder and spread its contents across the table between us. Text messages printed on paper, credit card statements, receipts from restaurants and hotels, email printouts, the documentary evidence of an affair that had been going on for months. "How long?" I asked, scanning the dates on the papers. "Based on what I can piece together, since about 3 weeks after we moved back to Brackett Hill," Nora said. "The first text I can find is from early June. So good to see you again. We should catch up soon." She handed me a sheet of paper with a series of text messages between Garrett and Diane. The conversation started innocently enough, old friends reconnecting, casual mentions of getting together for coffee to talk about the old days. But by July, the tone had shifted to something more intimate. "I can't stop thinking about Saturday night," I read aloud from one of Diane's messages. "It felt like we were 18 again." That would be July 15th, Nora said, consulting another paper. The night Garrett told me he was working late on Mrs. Patterson's car. Apparently, he was working on something else entirely. I continued reading, feeling sick as the evidence of my wife's betrayal spread out in black and white. Late-night phone calls when I was asleep, lunch meetings when I thought she was at work, elaborate lies about overtime and client dinners that were actually romantic encounters with her high school boyfriend. The hotel receipts are particularly interesting, Nora continued, pointing to a stack of credit card statements. The Riverside Inn, about 30 miles north of here. They've been meeting there twice a week for the past month. While you were at home, pregnant with his child, I said. While you were at home, trusting your wife, she corrected. We were both being played, James. The difference is, now we know about it. I studied the woman across from me, this person I'd barely known 48 hours ago, who was now offering to be my ally in what was shaping up to be a very ugly divorce. She was still obviously pregnant, still had that glow that came with expecting her first child, but there was steel in her eyes that hadn't been there at the housewarming party. What do you want out of this? I asked. I want him to pay, she said simply. Not just financially, though that's part of it. I want him to understand that actions have consequences. I want everyone in Brackett Hill to know exactly what kind of man he is, so that when Emma is old enough to ask why her parents aren't together, I can tell her the truth without feeling ashamed. And Diane? Your wife made choices too, Nora said. She knew I was pregnant. She knew we were trying to build a life together. She decided that her happiness was more important than mine or yours or my unborn daughter's. I think she should face the consequences of that decision. We spent the next hour going through the evidence, organizing it chronologically and discussing how it might be used in divorce proceedings. Nora had been thorough. She'd documented everything, photographed receipts and messages, even recorded a few phone conversations that Garrett had made from their home phone. I work in medical billing, she explained when I commented on her organizational skills. I'm used to documenting everything and keeping detailed records. It's amazing how those skills transfer to investigating your cheating husband. By the time we finished, I had copies of everything, enough evidence to prove adultery beyond any reasonable doubt, along with documentation of the financial resources Garrett and Diane had been spending on their affair. Hotel rooms, expensive dinners, gifts that I'd never seen Diane wear or use. There's one more thing, Nora said as we prepared to leave. I don't think they're planning to stop. What do you mean? She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message that had arrived that morning. It was from Garrett to Diane. Meet me at the usual place tonight. We need to talk about what happens next. The usual place? I asked. The Riverside Inn, Nora said. Room 237. They've been using it so regularly that they probably get a frequent guest discount. I stared at the message, feeling something cold and furious settle into my bones. Less than 48 hours after destroying 2 marriages in front of half the town, they were planning another romantic rendezvous. What time? I asked. 7 o'clock, according to the follow-up text. I checked my watch. It was almost 3 in the afternoon, which gave me about 4 hours to put together a plan that would make Saturday night's exposure look like a practice round. Nora, I said, how do you feel about a little creative photography? Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I think it sounds like exactly what they deserve. We spent another 30 minutes planning our approach, working out the details of what would probably be the most satisfying evening of my adult life. Nora would handle the technical aspects. She had a good camera and experience with surveillance from her previous job at a private medical practice. I would handle the logistics and the aftermath. One question, she said as we prepared to leave the diner. Are you sure you want to do this? Once we take these pictures, once we document what they're doing, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over, and it's going to be very public. I thought about Diane sitting in our kitchen that morning, still trying to minimize what she'd done, still looking for ways to avoid responsibility for the pain she'd caused. I thought about the text messages I'd just read, the evidence of months of lies and deception and calculated betrayal. My marriage was over the first time she texted him, I said. I just didn't know it yet. Good, Nora said, gathering up the evidence. Because after tonight, everyone in Brackett Hill is going to know exactly what kind of people we married. I drove back to town feeling more focused and determined than I had since Saturday night. The anger was still there, but it was controlled now, channeled into something productive. Diane had made the mistake of thinking I would just accept her betrayal, that I would be the understanding husband who quietly endured her affair for the sake of avoiding conflict. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. I spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls and arrangements, setting up the pieces for what I was already thinking of as the end game. By 6 o'clock, everything was in place. At 6:30, I met Nora in the parking lot of a gas station 2 miles from the Riverside Inn. She was driving a different car, her sister's sedan instead of her own Honda, and she'd traded her usual casual clothes for dark jeans and a black jacket that would help her blend into the shadows. "You ready for this?" she asked as we reviewed our plan one more time. "I've been ready since Saturday night," I said. "Let's go show them what accountability looks like." The Riverside Inn sat on a bluff overlooking the Penobscot River, the kind of place that advertised romantic getaways and discreet accommodations in the back pages of regional magazines. It was exactly the sort of location that cheating spouses chose for their affairs, far enough from home to avoid accidental encounters, cheap enough to pay cash, and run by people who didn't ask questions about guests who checked in for 3-hour stays. Nora and I parked in separate spots at the far end of the lot, where we could observe the main entrance without being obvious about it. She'd brought a professional quality camera with a telephoto lens, the kind used by private investigators and divorce attorneys who needed clear evidence of adultery. "There," she said, pointing toward the motel office. "Garrett's truck." I followed her gaze and saw the familiar red pickup parked near room 237, the same room number that had appeared in their text messages. The curtains were drawn, but there was light visible around the edges, and I could see shadows moving inside. "How long have they been here?" I asked. "About 20 minutes," Nora replied, checking the timestamp on her phone. "Diane's car's parked around back. I saw it when I drove through earlier." We settled in to wait, and I found myself studying the woman beside me. 3 days ago, she'd been a glowing, pregnant wife looking forward to raising her first child in a small town where everyone knew your name. Now she was sitting in a parking lot with surveillance equipment, documenting her husband's infidelity with the cold precision of a professional investigator. "You're handling this better than I expected," I said. "I cried for about 6 hours yesterday," she admitted. "Then I got angry. Then I got focused. Turns out pregnancy hormones work both ways. They don't just make you emotional, they can make you absolutely determined to protect your child from people who would hurt her." "Emma," I said, remembering the name they'd chosen for their daughter. "Emma," she confirmed. "She deserves better than a father who lies and cheats and abandons his responsibilities, and she deserves to know the truth about why her parents aren't together, not some sanitized version that protects his reputation." A car pulled into the parking lot, and we both tensed until we realized it was just another guest checking in. The Riverside Inn did a steady business in people who had reasons to avoid the nicer hotels in Bangor or Portland: traveling salesmen, construction workers, and apparently cheating spouses who thought they were being clever. "Movement," Nora said, raising her camera. I looked toward room 237 and saw the curtains shift slightly, then the door opened. Garrett stepped outside, looking around the parking lot with the paranoid caution of someone who knew he was doing something wrong. He was wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, his hair still damp from what had probably been a very intimate shower. Nora's camera clicked rapidly as she captured his movements. Through the telephoto lens, She could get clear shots of his face, his license plate, and the room number behind him. Perfect, she murmured. No question about who it is or where he is. Garrett walked to his truck and retrieved something from the cab, a bottle of wine and what looked like takeout containers from a restaurant. He glanced around the parking lot once more, then disappeared back into room 237. "Dinner and drinks," I said. "How romantic." "How stupid," Nora corrected. "He's using the same credit card he's always used, staying at the same motel, following the same pattern. If he was going to have an affair, you'd think he'd at least try to be smart about it." 20 minutes later, the door opened again, and this time Diane stepped outside. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something red and clingy that was definitely not from her usual conservative work wardrobe. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was laughing at something Garrett had said from inside the room. The sight of her hit me like a physical blow. This was my wife, the woman I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, looking happier and more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. Whatever was happening in that motel room, it was giving her something that our marriage apparently couldn't. "You okay?" Nora asked softly. "Yeah," I said, surprised to find that I meant it. "Actually, I think I am." She nodded and continued taking pictures as Diane walked to her car, parked discreetly behind the building just as Nora had said, and retrieved her own bag of supplies. Wine, food, probably lingerie that I'd never seen. The full romantic setup for an evening that she'd been planning while sitting across from me at breakfast, making small talk about our schedules and weekend plans. "Got it all," Nora said, lowering her camera. "Clear shots of both of them, the room number, the license plates, timestamps showing exactly when they arrived and how long they've been here. Plus, all the text messages and credit card records from before. Any divorce attorney would consider this a slam dunk." "Good," I said, "but we're not done yet." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Tara Williamson, Diane's best friend and co-worker, the woman who'd supposedly provided her with an alibi the night before. "James?" Tara's voice was cautious when she answered. "Is everything okay?" "Hi, Tara. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to thank you for letting Diane stay at your place last night. I know this whole situation is awkward for everyone." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Of course," she said finally. "That's what friends are for." "I hope she wasn't too upset," I continued. "She seemed pretty shaken when she left this morning." Another pause. "This morning?" "When she left your place to come home and get some clothes," I said, injecting just the right amount of confusion into my voice. "Around 8:30? She said you made her coffee and gave her some advice about how to handle things." "James?" Tara said slowly. "Diane wasn't here last night. She called around 10 and asked if she could come over, but then she called back an hour later and said she'd found somewhere else to stay." Bingo. I thanked Tara and hung up, then turned to Nora with a smile that probably looked predatory. "She lied about where she spent Sunday night too," I said, "which means she was probably here, with him, less than 24 hours after their public humiliation." "These people have no shame," Nora said, shaking her head. "But that's good for us. The more evidence we have of ongoing adultery, the stronger our cases become." We waited another hour, documenting their movements every time they stepped outside. They seemed to be treating the evening like a celebration, complete with multiple trips to their cars for supplies and what looked like a very intimate conversation on the walkway outside their room. Finally, around 9:30, I decided it was time for the final act. "You sure about this?" Nora asked as I prepared to get out of the car. "Absolutely," I said. "They've had their fun. Now it's time for them to face the consequences." I walked across the parking lot to room 237, my footsteps echoing in the quiet evening air. The curtains were still drawn, but I could hear voices inside, Diane's laugh, Garrett's deeper rumble, the sound of people who thought they were safe from discovery. I knocked on the door. The voices inside stopped immediately, followed by frantic whispering and the sound of people scrambling to get dressed. After about 30 seconds, Garrett's voice came through the door. "Who is it?" "Maintenance," I said, disguising my voice slightly. "We've had reports of a water leak. Need to check the bathroom." More whispering, then footsteps approaching the door. The deadbolt clicked, and the door opened to reveal Garrett wearing hastily pulled-on jeans and a guilty expression that would have been comical under different circumstances. "There's no water leak," he said, trying to block my view into the room. "No," I agreed, "but there is a problem." I pushed past him into the room where I found Diane sitting on the bed in a hotel bathrobe, her hair disheveled and her makeup smeared. The remains of their romantic dinner were scattered across the small table, along with an empty wine bottle and what looked like expensive lingerie draped over a chair. "Hello, Diane," I said pleasantly. "Having a nice evening?" Her face went white, then red, then settled into an expression of defiance mixed with panic. "James, what are you doing here?" "Documenting adultery," I said, pulling out my phone and taking several pictures before either of them could react. "For my divorce attorney." Garrett stepped toward me, his hands clenched into fists. "You can't just barge in here." "Actually, I can," I said, continuing to take pictures. "This is a public accommodation, and you're committing adultery with my wife. I have every right to document evidence of your affair." "This is harassment," Diane said, clutching the bathrobe tighter around herself. "No," I replied. "This is accountability. This is what happens when you think you can lie and cheat and destroy other people's lives without consequences." I turned to Garrett, who was still standing between me and the door like he was considering violence. "By the way, your wife is in the parking lot with a camera. She's been taking pictures for the past 2 hours. Turns out, pregnant women are very motivated when it comes to protecting their children from cheating fathers." The color drained out of his face. "Nora's here?" "Oh yes," I said. "And she's got some very interesting evidence about how long this has been going on. Hotel receipts, text messages, credit card statements. Quite a paper trail you two have left." Diane stood up from the bed, her composure finally cracking completely. "You can't do this to us. We have rights." "You had responsibilities," I interrupted. "To your marriage, to your community, to the people who trusted you. You chose to ignore those responsibilities, and now you get to deal with the results." I took a few more pictures, making sure to capture the wine bottle, the lingerie, and the general state of the room that clearly indicated what had been happening there. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "Tomorrow morning, I'm filing for divorce on grounds of adultery. Nora is doing the same thing. By the end of the week, everyone in Brackett Hill is going to know exactly what you've been doing and where you've been doing it." "James, please," Diane said. And for a moment she sounded like the woman I'd married instead of the stranger who'd been lying to me for months. "We can work this out. We can go to counseling." "We could have done that before you decided to have an affair," I said. "Now it's too late. You made your choice, Diane. Both of you did. Now you get to live with the consequences." I headed for the door, then turned back for one final comment. "Oh, and Garrett, your wife wanted me to tell you that she's already spoken to a lawyer about custody arrangements. Apparently, adultery doesn't look good when you're trying to get visitation rights with your daughter." I left them sitting in their motel room, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal and the wreckage of their carefully planned affair. Outside, Nora was waiting by her car, her camera still in hand and a satisfied expression on her face. "How did it go?" she asked. "Better than I expected," I said. "They're not nearly as clever as they thought they were." "Good," she said, "because tomorrow everyone in Brackett Hill is going to know exactly what kind of people they really are." As we drove away from the Riverside Inn, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of control over my own life. For too long, I'd been reacting to Diane's lies and deceptions, trying to save a marriage that she'd already abandoned. Now, finally, I was taking action. The game was over, and I'd won. Not because I was smarter or better than them, but because I'd chosen to face the truth instead of running from it. Because I'd found an ally in someone who understood what betrayal felt like and was willing to fight back. And because sometimes the best revenge is simply making sure that everyone knows exactly what happened. By tomorrow afternoon, Diane and Garrett's affair would be the talk of Brackett Hill. By the end of the week, they'd be social pariahs in a town where reputation mattered more than almost anything else. They'd wanted excitement and romance and the thrill of forbidden love. Instead, they were going to get exactly what they deserved: